Fantasy, the genre of storytelling where people in castles and fortified city rely on grand spellcasters to ward off dangerous monsters like dragons, where dwarves shelter in great citadels of stone, and where walls of magic or masterwork protect the civilized lands from those beyond. Fantasy often mirrors real-world history. The gigantic walls of Ba Sing Se in Avatar call back to fortified city walls, only heightened. Most fantasy cities are encased in multiple layers of walls, which is a real-world historical fortification technique. And walls which defend a land or delineate a border, like the Great Ice Wall in A Song of Ice and Fire, they evoke perhaps heightened versions of historic walls like Hadrian's famous wall, or the Great Wall of China. This is without even mentioning the prevailing image of fantasy, which is the great fortified fortress or castle. But as with knights, swords, and even the thriving of humans, are we looking too much at a romanticized version of our own history when we make our fantasy? Are we world building, or just putting a bunch of our expectations of what the past sort of might have been like into one place and calling it a day once we've added dragons? Are walls actually a practical defense method in fantasy media? Let's discuss. First, ground rules. I'm going to be avoiding D&D style magic and fantasy specifically for this video, because the level of magic and the amount of monsters are generally higher than in the rest of fantasy media. Oftentimes in fantasy, both magic and monsters are less prevalent and ubiquitous, and monsters are less varied and eldritch. We'll say, for the sake of argument, that each nation has access to maybe a couple of spellcasters, that magical gifts are rare and precious, and that the monsters of the world generally act in a similar vein to beasts, with a few exceptions. So with all that said, we have a world that looks quite like Westeros, seen as a kind of low magic setting, perhaps including a few more of the classic ways of doing magic into Westeros' fairly limited system, like the ability to shoot fire out of your hands, say. Crucially, for this discussion, we're going to be assuming that teleportation magic does not exist. But if you do want a full analysis of how that might affect world building, I do have a video specifically on that topic. So what are walls good at? They provide a physical and visual barrier between 2 points. They are an advantageous position in defending from high ground against a grounded threat, and depending on the technological development of your world, serve as one or many of deterrent, inconvenient, time-consuming obstacle, long-term defensible position, or impassable barrier. Historically, walls have been used to keep people both in and out, and they are generally built to make breaching difficult, expensive, and obvious enough to allow defenders some time to prepare a response to an offensive threat. Oftentimes in warfare, walls are theoretically breachable, using technology available to people at that time. So oftentimes, walls are used as a part of a defensive strategy, not a whole defensive strategy. A lot of the time, for example, a breach is one of the most dangerous places to be in any battle, because walls, even when destroyed, provide natural choke points that funnel enemies and defendants together. Gates also have this same effect in warfare of creating a funnel of usually 2 opposing forces, and it is a very common tactic to use some form of natural barrier or natural choke point bolstered by a wall for defensive purposes in history. But what of fantasy? Dwarves, elves, and dragons, how do they affect all of this? Well, let's start with the most obvious point. Dragons can fly. In fact, so can many fantasy creatures. Griffins, wyverns, giant eagles, harpies, angels, Pegasi, to name a few. In some fantasy worlds, people can fly, either using ingenious devices, natural features, or magic itself. From birdfolk to dragonfolk, from wizards to shapeshifters, goodness, even someone warging into the eyes of a raven, to use a Westerosi example, could theoretically bypass a wall, in terms of bypassing that visual blocking element and being able to scout from above, therefore gaining information, which is a very important tool in warfare. The trouble is, walls may prepare you against an army on the ground, but they do almost nothing against an airborne attack. For that, you'd need to also add stone fortifications on a roof, and at that point, you've got an entirely enclosed fort or castle. And they're not built necessarily to be self-sustaining, to sustain an entire population and all the food it needs to survive. So if you are focusing on the fort as a true defensive point to protect yourself from armed forces on the ground and sky, you're going to be sacrificing a lot of critical infrastructure, fields, and general labourers to that effort, which is not necessarily ideal. If you have a walled settlement with internal watchtowers, for example, that could alleviate some of the internal pressure of an attack from the sky to provide some recourse against such creatures. Although the idea of firing off ballistae, arrows, and all sorts of other projectiles inside one's own city walls, or trained towards the interior of a town or city, is probably going to do a little more harm than good for your regular airborne attack. And equally, this is a three-dimensional battle. I would grant the advantage to the creature with a full range of movement, as opposed to the creature that is attacking with projectiles that require a certain range and aim to intersect with their target. That becomes much harder with an extra plane of movement added in. I also mentioned earlier that walls are sometimes a two-way street. They keep people in, and they keep people out. In the case of a threat from a gargantuan creature like a dragon, or even just a minor threat, panic is pretty inevitable. In a state of mass panic, which would likely come with an airborne attack out of the blue, it's very likely that people will wish to rush to safety, wherever that safety may be, whether inside another layer of walls or outside a wall or a watchtower or a specific gate. That will cause a crush. And because walls are so good at keeping people in and creating natural choke points when people want to enter or leave, it turns out these choke points are going to cause some serious hold-ups, snarl-ups, queues, and probably contribute to a trampling effect, which might indeed cause more damage to the people trying to flee than any monster could. Unless it's a dragon seeking to torch everything, in which case, fair enough, run. But the point really is this: once your enemy are inside the walls, they become an obstacle preventing your escape. And flying creatures don't even necessarily need to come and attack physically to be a massive threat to a fortified city. A reasonably intelligent and organised group of flying creatures could start a massive terror campaign simply by flying high above a city with a rock, or say a rotting carcass, and just letting it fall into the city's streets, causing chaos and panic, and probably a death or two each time. If such creatures would stay high enough on approach, walls may end up being functionally useless to stop them, as may any attempts at ranged combat, which, especially if the creatures are able to get above the city, might do more harm than good if fired again towards the interior of a settlement. You would need sophisticated systems to try and avoid this particular threat, such as perhaps an alarmed barrier of magic, if that's possible, going all the way up from your walls. Perhaps magical warding of some sorts, or in the worst case scenario, covered walkways and towers and covered streets, just to make sure that mass panic is not going to start setting in as soon as the first rock or rotting cow drops. But the point really is, walls may be effective at keeping a ground-based army away, but even a small flying strike team could rain terror on an entire city, especially if they have any way to gain access to explosives, or indeed rotting carcasses, because those being dropped or trapped inside cities spreads disease, weakens the populace. It's a bad time for everyone involved. And then, as people are leaving this place, these flying creatures can then pick off the caravans of people leaving as well. But surely walls would still be useful at stopping the armies of men, elves and dwarves, right? But then again, most historic attacks on walls don't feature siege engines, or thousands of orcs with ladders, or gigantic battering rams with canonical names wielded by teams of mountain trolls. Helm's Deep, as battles go, is relatively unusual, in that both sides' commanders decide that an actual pitched battle is preferable for their side, despite the fact that one side is defending from atop very, very well fortified walls. Honestly, I would question Saruman's military expertise. On cursory inspection, Helm's Deep really does seem like the perfect target, instead, for a siege. It seems to be a fortress with a single gate built into a cliff face with no obvious secondary means of escape. Now, Helm's Deep did actually have a secret postern gate that led through a series of caves and eventually to freedom, as it rightfully should have for a city so bold to build in such a location. And this is normal. Historically, hidden or secret or small side gates have often been used as a means to smuggle out an elite group of riders or messengers to get word out to allies to come and relieve the siege. Pigeons are also another way to go and get some help from an ally to break the siege from behind, bringing another army and hopefully pincering in this besieging army that has surrounded your walls and is trying to starve you out. Magic in a fantasy world could fulfill a similar function if communication magic is available. To have an effective siege, an invading army needs to have some plan for how to cut these resources off. Perhaps by encircling the entire city, ensuring that there are no hidden gates, cutting off any supply lines and blockading inward roads, scouting using the eyes of trained birds, which may also be birds of prey trained specifically to take out any messenger pigeons trying to escape, and probably some sort of diviner who would be integral to any siege offensive, specifically to divine any internal divisions within the besieged camp, to ascertain when they're going to try and sneak out a messenger or some sort of message and which means they're going to use to do it, or even predicting the arrival of relief forces to make sure that your besieging army is not surprised and having to fight a war on two fronts. But here's the thing, in real-world history, sieges are hard. One of the major challenges is actually keeping an army motivated. While your enemies are in their homes, sheltering with their families from a besieging army behind city walls, a besieging army is in temporary shelters far, far from home comforts. Most historic sieges fail because they're either broken up by a relief army or they break up themselves from the arduous task of having long watches, constant paranoia, and having to live far away from home for a long, long time. Spending 10 years besieging a city, like the legends say of Troy. That is such a huge portion of a soldier's life, let alone their active military life. It's a really serious commitment. It's not practicable to expect a person to stay sitting in an army camp for over a tenth of their life until their enemy eventually might surrender from exhaustion, frustration, or starvation. And that is how most historic sieges go. If the defenders make it through the winter, it is unlikely that an army has enough legs, enough supplies, enough supply lines, and enough goodwill to actually make it to the next winter to try again to starve them out. People just have too much to do. They have harvests to bring in, families to see and hug and live with, and children to raise. But do elves? Do dwarfs? Both are traditionally depicted as fairly long-lived. Elves have great patience and oneness with nature. Dwarves have supreme stubbornness. Would an elf, out of boredom or frustration, abandon a siege that is not even going to be 100th of its lifetime? Probably not. To us, that's less than a year. Maybe one campaigning season with the army. That's doable. Assuming elves live to, say, 1,000 years, Troy might just be a busy summer in the biography of an elf. With the elven natural proclivity for oneness with the land, it's possible that a local forest nearby a city may just be the perfect staging ground or camping ground for their siege. It is entirely possible that an encampment or settlement may not even know it's being besieged for many months, with the scale of elfin warfare and perhaps the languidity with which it progresses. The local orchards and woods may just be less profitable to farmers and hunters. Inroads on trade may just stall and entire shipments just disappear with the utmost stealth and grace, of course. The elves may be able to choke you out over many, many years without you even noticing their army in your vicinity, until your whole city is starving and then they ride up to your gates looking ready for a fight. It's entirely possible that elven incursions into humanoid lands may begin as these kind of long-scale sieges. The first settlements that are nearby other creatures' settlements may well begin as siege camps. The elves may simply set up shop and start siphoning off trade and opportunities, economic opportunities from a walled city nearby, as the locals will go to them for advice, wisdom, and great craftsmanship. Heck, even some of the members of the city may choose to move to this elven settlement, abandoning their walls for the riches and wisdom that the elves have to offer. An elven siege may last human generations, with the great elven citadel growing up as the great human citadel, let's say, is abandoned, its walls left to crumble. In a less macro scale, it is entirely possible that elves are also simply the worst creatures to be under a siege from. One careless watch patrol spending a little too long with a lit flame on top of the walls, one attempt at breaking the siege by riding out of the city gates, and an arrow is coming for you. From perhaps sights unseen, perhaps tiny little knots of wood and forest, far, far in the distance, far beyond what anyone else can do, an elf targets you, and you're done. The only thing more terrifying than an army at your gates is an army that has hidden and secreted itself throughout the local landscape around you, without sight nor sound of their presence. An army that has absolutely no problem waiting for you to starve, or for your children to starve, because this is just their summer break. Well, there may be one type of creature that it is worse to be besieged by. Dwarves. They are often known for three things in fantasy: stubbornness, stonecraft, and engineering. Throughout the entire history of large-scale armed conflict, engineers have been integral. Most of this engineering requires local resources like woodland or rivers. But I can easily imagine dwarves making the most natural and terrifying sappers in existence. Sapper comes from the French sapeur, which refers specifically to a type of combat engineer specialised in undermining and destroying, breaking down fortified positions. Oftentimes, historically, they are known for digging zigzagging trenches to avoid fire from a city's walls, so that they can reach said walls and then begin to breach them from up close. In almost every fantasy media property I've seen, dwarves are excellent at tunnelling, getting through dirt and stone, and knowing when their tunnels are going to collapse and not going to collapse. They have an inherent knack for tunnelling. Add to that their natural short height, which protects them in a low trench zigzagging towards a wall, and the fact that they're traditionally often depicted as experts in explosives and destroying vast quantities of stone as well. Sappers and miners were first used on a really large scale in our real world in the 16th century, at least with access to some sort of artillery and explosives. And there are examples of walls being breached by collapsed tunnels and undermining far, far before the 16th century as well. But in my mind, if we assume that a classic way to defend a city is with a wall, we can also assume that the dwarves would be the very first to invent a sapping and mining hybrid technology of warfare. I think this would come very early on. It may well be the first thing a dwarf would think upon seeing a great high wall. Indeed, with the dwarves' expertise in mining, their increased longevity like the elves, and their natural stubbornness, I think they may well be the most terrifying military force to face in an entrenched fortified settlement. They can undermine areas of a city, allowing passage for troops inside. They can undermine the walls, causing them to collapse all at once, perhaps coordinating a great strike across many different regions, too many breaches to count. They could even dig under storehouses and guard posts and collapse them en masse through burning the supports to create maximum chaos or just the destruction of a defensive potential of a place. In my mind, any besieging army, any army worth its salt, would be employing dwarven miners or engineer mercenaries to enable the easy and quick destruction of any opponent's walls. Maybe not quick, but I think the dwarven military engineers would be utterly terrifying to face. And depending on how willing the dwarves are to work with other creatures or other armies, it may well be the case that dwarven mercenaries make an awful lot of coin. Dwarven houses make an awful lot of coin selling their engineer mercenaries out to various wars on the surface that are trivialized by the concept of being able to accurately, safely, and effectively dig underneath a wall or essentially any military installation at all. Much of fantasy warfare, counterintuitively, may thus be fought in tunnels and counter-tunnels underneath the very great stone walls that we so love to depict in fantasy. So, in fantasy, we have creatures that can fly over your walls. Individuals who are better at besieging than even the great Greek heroes of old, and experts in bypassing fortifications by simply tunnelling under them. Does this mean there's no point in a fantasy world in building a wall? No. In all use cases, walls serve to stop a footbound army, which is the vast majority of fantasy armies, from entering into, or firing into, or seeing into a settlement. They mostly serve as insurance, to buy time to gather your own forces to defend a breach, or to buy time to get allies to come to your aid. Because as always, one of the major tools in warfare is communication. If magic allows you to send messages outside of your besieged city, either invisible messengers or psychic-based messages beamed into another creature's head around the world, you have a chance to turn your horrific siege into a two-pronged attack on the besieging army from both sides, turning the tables on anyone trying to attack your great walls. As long as you have time and the ability to communicate, you can turn the tables on a besieging army pretty quickly. That's your best bet. So are walls useful? Yes, they keep the goblins, the orcs, the trolls and the wolves away from the people living inside your population centres. Such creatures rarely have the patience and technology for a good old siege. But would walls see the ubiquity in historic defence that they see in our world? I'm not so sure. Once walls became easy enough to breach in our real-world history that it was more expensive to put a wall up than to tear one down, we started not to bother building new walls. Even the relatively recent innovation of the Star Fort is not that useful in our modern warfare, which is filled with autonomous soldiers and autonomous drones. Walls essentially tell people, hey, after this point, you are not welcome, if they don't know already. It's not like earthworks, border walls, dikes and border markings wouldn't see use. But I wonder if there aren't better ways to use basic fantasy magic to ward people away. Like a border filled with magical wards or warnings. Seals which detect and allow through people of a certain heritage or with bearing a certain symbol. Magical alarms, rows of crystals, skulls or bones scattered around a region to protect it from any spiritual and physical incursion through magic. In conclusion, then, walls are indeed brilliant tools for warding away threats, fortification, land capture, and staking a claim to a location. But walls aren't the be-all and end-all of fantasy defense, and they're certainly more vulnerable in the fantasy worlds than in our real-world history. There's a reason why fantasy walls so often are magnified tenfold from what any real wall in our world has ever been. There's a reason why the ice wall is so high, and also why dragons are sometimes depicted in A Song of Ice and Fire's derivative works as preventing dragons from passing by it through some great malaise and ill feeling, ill omens perhaps. Not always, though. In fantasy, we want our walls to function like walls did in real life, because that's an interesting story, to have a place that you cannot go beyond. But in reality, rather, in fantasy, there may just be better ways to keep a type of creature out of a certain place. But with all that said, please do let me know your opinions, your thoughts in the comments. I'd be curious to see what other people's perspectives are on this, and if you can recommend me any media that does walls well without just scaling them up. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.